The first whisper arrives as a change in the starlight, a slight tilt in the spectra that suggests a visitor carrying cold memory from a sun not our own, streaking through the heliosphere on a track so precise it feels like intention laid down in calculus. And the rumor inside observatories pass from night crews with caffeine-bright eyes to day teams nursing models is that its heart is not quiet, that there is a phase hidden in the dark parameters, a threshold, and if that threshold is crossed, if the core ignites, not like a star, not with fusion's sovereign fire, but in the smaller, wilder way of trapped energy suddenly set free, then the clockwork of this system could skip a beat and the music we call stability would change key. We gave it a name to steady our hands, 3I Atlas, the third interstellar wanderer we have caught threading our sky. But the comfort of naming is thin when the numbers surge. Telescopes knitted across continents watched its light curve loosen and tighten with a period suggestive of a tumbling spin state, and the hyperbolic excess speed, v, in the notebooks, spoke of a journey that began under another sun's weather, beyond the frost lines we draw for our own origin myths. The orbit reconstruction grew like a cathedral of probabilities. Inbound vector, grazing the outer magnetized breath of Jupiter, a long needle through the ecliptic cloth. Perihelion at a distance that would wake the shallow-buried volatiles and test the deeper ones. Spectrographs returned bands of CO and CO2 that fit comfortably with the comets we know. But behind them, shoulders, small absorptions that didn't map neatly to catalogs, like the ghost stamps of ices rearranged under cosmic rays for 1,000,000 winters. To describe it was to admit this object had kept counsel with a different kind of night, and it carried the chemical grammar of that night into ours. We listened close. Our high-cadence photometry took its pulse, catching micro-variations that only made sense if jets were firing from the sunward flank, a series of feathered puffs that nudged the path by micronewtons, while the mathematics took note and smiled that tight, worried smile it reserves for truths that cannot be ignored. The non-gravitational terms, A1 radial, A2 transverse, A3 normal, appeared in the fit like fingerprints, consistent over days, then sharpening with perihelion approach. Each jet was a sentence, the coma an essay of sublimation and dust. Each sentence, read by the Gauss variational equations, translated into a change of fate. We mapped the spin, the likely axes, the possible moments of inertia, and the Yorp-like torques that sunlight can impose on a body that is not entirely symmetrical. Radar flicker hinted at a nucleus faceted by history, maybe tens to hundreds of meters across, big enough to be serious, small enough to be quick, and the albedo suggested a coat of carbon and time. From these, a portrait emerged, not certain but confident, a relic, yes, but an active one, in the process of deciding its own end. Then, as if the cosmos wanted to write a footnote to humility, the accelerations did not quite scale with incident flux as expected. The thermal modelers went back to their laptops, coughing equations into the long night, and returned with a hypothesis that turned heads. Pockets of amorphous ice buried beneath a more crystalline shield. Metastable reservoirs whose latent heat, when unlocked by a migrating thermal wave, would cascade in an exothermic reordering, the disorder resolving into order with a release of energy that could propagate like a slow internal flame. Not combustion in the oxygen fire sense, but ignition as a phase transition, a percolating network of transformations that raise pressure in sealed caverns until rock yields, vents form, and jets become more like geysers with directionality and force to spare. And if among the clathrates there were cages with trapped CO or even H2, if radiolysis over interstellar years had loaded those cages with reactive species, then a crack might do more than sigh. It might speak with a jet that reorganizes orbits. We are conservative creatures in the face of theory that runs. Yet the numbers did not blink. The energy budget of such a reconfiguration could outpace quiet sublimation by orders for minutes, hours, perhaps periodic days. We have seen strange before. Oumuamua taught us that interstellar bodies don't owe us the decency of resembling our expectations. That cigar shape was a lazy metaphor for fractal shard. And Tuai Borisov taught us that some wanderers are comets, writ in a familiar hand but signed in starlight, not our own. 3I Atlas, though, stitched the two tendencies, a comet's chemistry with an asteroid's stubbornness, a light curve suggesting tumbling yet with pockets of coherence, as if parts of it were phase-locked and others still negotiating. That is the atmosphere in which speculation becomes method. Could it be engineered? The phrase hides in jokes in hallways, then stands in colloquia without apologizing. Exotic sail? We must see. Lured radiation pressure and found it wanting. Outgassing with a geometry that mimics thrust? That stayed on the table. Microbial hibernation? Too early, too speculative, yet the mind will run ahead of its feet when the road opens. We index the hypotheses, not as credos, but as scaffolds for observation, so that each new datum could race to the right shelf and either take root or collapse from lack of evidence. The coincidences arrived like a choir. A sequence of magnetar flares in a distant arm lit the X-ray sky weeks before our wanderer crossed the plain where the solar wind grows turbulent. A coronal mass ejection stretched the sun's influence like taffy on the very night the jet's cadence changed. A narrow braid of interplanetary dust thickened our line of sight for just long enough to drive up the noise in our measurements by an amount that would be trivial any other week. None of this proves anything beyond the universe's habit of making rhythms out of randomness, but it tugged at the tribal part of the scientific brain that hears drums and wonders about plans. We know better than to baptize coincidence as causation. Still, we collect them, inventory their improbability, and leave them on the table where curiosity can see them and sharpen its knives. Orbital dynamics, meanwhile, did not wait for our internal debates. The path of an interstellar interloper through a planetary system is a kind of education in gravity's dialects, the broad accent of the sun, the local idioms of the giants, the whispers of resonances that can catch a body and spin it like a child's toy. 3I Atlas slipped past Jupiter's hill sphere at a distance that would not smear its destiny into a captured comet, but close enough that the energy trade mattered. The slingshot was gentle, a pianist's hand on the shoulder, not a wrestler's throw, yet those micronewtons of jetting sat on top of it like notes on a stave, modulating the tune. We saw hypotheticals bloom in the integrators. A slightly hotter jet and the outbound asymptote would turn a hair's breadth closer to the ecliptic, setting up a future in which the dust stream it shed would braid itself into a meteor complex intersecting Earth's orbit decades hence. A slightly cooler jet, and it would whisper off-plane, seeding the high latitudes with particles destined to paint auroral curtains in years to come. Systems are sensitive. Whole chronologies of weather and ritual depend on grains of dust you can hardly see. Then came the blackout, not a conspiracy in the night, but the gentler, more ordinary conspiracy of geometry and weather. A new moon, a southern ocean storm, a maintenance cycle on a crucial spectrograph, and a solar flare that raised the radio noise floor all composed themselves into a week-long blink in our data. The object rotated unseen, the sun kept singing, and when our eyes found it again, the rhythm of the jets had shifted, the amplitude of the light curve flattened as if a lobe had broken or a vent choked or opened. The gap was just long enough to paint the imagination in wilder colors. What turned inside that dark? Teams argued about selection biases and recalibration, about whether an ignition front, if such a thing were real, would have time to propagate. The cautious took refuge in uncertainty, while the bold sketched mission profiles on napkins. In the literature of exploration, you learn to honor the blackout without worshiping it. It breeds myths when you aren't careful, and clarity if you are. We didn't have clarity yet. We had a changed object and a list of plausible stories. From those stories, consequences. If the core truly crossed a threshold where metastability folds into release, the near-term effect would be jets strong enough to remodel the orbit or fracture the body. Fragmentation can be a kind of mercy. Smaller pieces mean faster cooling, but it can also spray the inner system with a storm of shards that inherit the parent's velocity plus chaos, laying down meteoroid streams that planets must thread. Earth fat with atmosphere converts streams into light and sometimes into injuries. Probes and satellites are thinner-skinned. Even without fracture, the ignition runaway could rewrite the outgassing chemistry, turning the coma into a carrier of molecules our system rarely smells, hydrocarbons knitted under cold that our sunlight will teach to break and recombine into new airs around worlds that do not expect them. These are not apocalypses, they are complications at scale, the kind of weather that requires new protocols. We drafted them, not in panic, but in the quiet way navigators learn new reefs. There's a deeper consequence that cannot be measured in newtons and pascals. Each interstellar visitor is a message in a bottle from a sea you cannot cross in a human lifetime, and each bottle is a workshop where nature has tried combinations we have not. That alone argues for a response measured in craft and courage. We began to speak of interceptors that do not wait for windows in rocketry's rut-bound calendar, but sprint from orbital depots with fuel already stored under shadowed wings, of swarm probes that sip power from photovoltaic skins until they can leap in synchrony into a rendezvous that is more like a dance than a chase. The questions we wanted to ask were not exotic. What is your density without the lies gravity tells when jets are whispering? What is your composition beneath the veneer's radiation paints? What is the topology of your cracks, the thermodynamics of your heart? Yet to ask them directly is to lay hands on a messenger that might at any moment change its mind. That is a design challenge, yes, but it is also a spiritual one. How do you approach the foreign without assuming it will stay put for your convenience? So the brief amplifies beyond a single object. If a core can ignite in this small way and rumple the calculus of a solar system, then our plans for going outward must include a chapter on surprises that press from the inside out. It is one thing to armor a spacecraft against micrometeorites and solar storms, another to teach it to listen for the early noises of a runaway phase change in the body it's courting, to read heat not just as temperature but as narrative. The technology asks for subtlety, thermal imagers that can sift a tenth of a Kelvin wick without blinking, spectrometers that can separate siblings in a crowded family of lines, autonomous navigation that can sidestep a jet that wasn't on the map an hour ago. The sociology asks for something subtler, patience before headlines, humility before the provocation of the unknown, the willingness to update caution in increments the public can understand. To build for the future is to set these in a scaffold that money can touch and time can test. You can feel the philosophical gravity well deepen as you say these things aloud. We are a species that learn to count seasons by the cold breath of comets, to read omens in tails and halos. Now we learn to read physics, where our ancestors read moods. The awe is the same, only better equipped. To say that 3I Atlas might carry chemical stories from another sun is to say that the universe is an author with many hands, and that this volume, however small, deserves a place on the shelf we reserve for books that change how we dream. If its core ignites, it will do so because nature rewards certain arrangements of molecules under certain histories, and that should not frighten us. It should instead entice us to widen our apprenticeship. The cosmos is not hostile or kind, it is fertile. Fertility looks like risk when you are not ready. Still, we do not romanticize hazard. The integrators chew the latest accelerations and spit out a family of futures. Most branch into harmless outbound narratives. A minority write new meteor dates into calendars our grandchildren will keep. A thin sliver wedges a fragment into an earth-guarded trajectory where it will wait. A dark, eloquent pebble for a mission built by those not yet born. In all of them, the lesson is the same. The interstellar will not stop coming. The solar neighborhood is not empty. It is an air we are only now feeling with instruments sensitive enough to bear its draft. Waiting for the next visitor without preparation would be like sailing crowded seas with no charts. So we draft a new kind of chart. It includes not just ephemerides, but recipes. What to do when the light curve flattens, when A2 flips sign, when the coma's chemistry adds a line no catalog owns. We let the page include dispatches from philosophy and art because they have always had something to say about sudden change, about the dignity of the alien, about the poise required to stand on a threshold and not flinch at the view. And we let it include, because this object has taught us, a paragraph titled Warning that is less an alarm than an instruction in attention. If the interior crosses its quiet Rubicon and the jets rise to sufficiency, the orbit will bend and the light will lie. Do not mistake the new story for a betrayal of the old one. Adjust. In the end, beneath the instruments and the plans, the thing that drives us is older than science and entirely at home in it. The sense that to be human is to address the universe as if it could answer. 3i Atlas streaks through our sovereignty like a signature we cannot counterfeit, and we, because we are what we are, raise dishes and mirrors and minds toward it. We will send machines, yes, and someday we will send ourselves along interstellar lines of our own, carrying our volatile cores under hulls. We pray will not ignite in the destructive sense, but will continue to ignite in the other one, the ignition of curiosity, of knowledge, of the long, patient fire that moves civilizations. We have the wit to read danger without surrendering to it, the grace to let astonishment be a discipline. And so the visitor goes on, and we go after in numbers and in wonder, knowing that the cosmos does not owe us safety, but will reward the courage to meet it with open eyes, practiced hands, and a heart that measures risk as part of beauty